I always used to think that the old classic stories were simply made better than modern stories, that they avoided the cliches and tropes and did something sophisticated, that they avoided all the common pitfalls that modern stories will use. I recently listened to the audiobook for the Count of Monte Cristo, and what struck me the most is that all the typical plot arcs and all the normal cliches were there. We have a main character who has this horrific betrayal done by his seemingly, all of his friends, and now he's cast into this dark abyss, but then he returns, and now he has this whole revenge arc to play out for him. But not just that, we go through a training arc where he starts off being able to read and having no knowledge of the world, to being highly sophisticated and highly educated, and now, of course, on top of it, unimaginably rich. And now he gets to go before the girl who he once loved, who's now married his rival. And it's like all of these dynamics come into play, and all of this in a book written some 150 years ago. All of this in supposed classic literature, highbrow, pinky out stuff. These are the tropes that normally fill the drama-made mediocre shows that are a hit for a short time and then completely forgotten about. So what we're going to do today is take a look at the Count of Monte Cristo and see how it does it. See how it does these cliches so well and what makes them work. Before we get into it, let me know down in the comments what your favorite revenge story would be. Something higher art or sophisticated like Old Boy or Berserk, or something more action fun like John Wick. But let me know down below and let me know what about it that drew you to it. What made you enjoy it. Anyway, let's get back to it. When we're looking at a revenge arc, it's almost the reverse of a horror or thriller movie. Usually for horror, you'll have someone or something or some creature that's supposed to be dead that has returned, defying the elements and morality and God, or, whatever else you want to have it, and now is preying upon this set of main characters, and they return to terrorize those, who have deemed to do something so wrong and horrific as to impede upon their isolation or something like that. And a similar thing will happen for these revenge stories, where you'll have a group of characters who have legitimately wronged something or some character, and now we see almost from their point of view that this long dead character is returned to terrorize them. And that's the interesting thing, is that Count of Monte Cristo could almost be played out as a horror movie if you look at it instead of from Dantes' point of view, Edmond Dantes, our main character, if you look at it from the point of view of the antagonist, the people who have wronged him, because they are going about their normal life, and suddenly all these disastrous elements start happening. Everything begins to go wrong. Everything begins to fall apart. And the key part for this is, of course, you have to have the morality on your side. You have to have the justification for why you can enact this revenge. You have to have the capability, and usually this focus is around building up a solid main character, someone you can align yourself with and someone who you believe has the right to enact revenge. And so what we're going to do, let's look at the origin for our main character, Edmond Dantes. We start off along the French coastline with our poor French sailor named Edmond Dantes, and he's working on this ship, and he successfully brings the ship back to port safely after the death of its captain. And the owner, Mr. Morel, overjoyed with the return of his ship and how well Edmond has done, promotes him. And Edmond's life seemingly is on the upswing. He's poor, but this promotion will bring him much more wealth than he's had before. And he's betrothed to marry the beautiful Mercedes, a beautiful young girl who's head over heels for him. And finally, he's back home in time to help care for his elderly father, who's had to starve himself because they don't have enough money. All of this begins to look like things are turning around. And in order to fulfill the dying wish of his old captain, his old sea captain, the one who died, which is why he had to take over, Edmond goes to Paris to deliver a letter. And while he's away, 3 people from his hometown write their own letter to the prosecutor, Monsieur Villefort, that Edmond is a Bonapartist and extremely violent. And side note, at this time, Napoleon Bonaparte, who previously had taken power after the French Revolution, went around invading Europe and yada 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 from there, until he was finally defeated in prison, and the royalists, the king of Louis XVIII, was returned to power after Napoleon was defeated, but now he's been imprisoned at the island of Elba, and there are Bonapartists at work who are working to try and free Napoleon in order that he can come back and retake control of France. So there's a whole lot of espionage and counter-espionage going on at the time, and which means that anyone who is accused of being a Bonapartist or part of a Bonapartist plot would be a high subject of interest. This is the plot by these three individuals who are trying to get rid of Edmond. They're very, very well aware of that. And so one of the men, Mr. Ferdinand, is in love with Mercedes. He wants Edmond out of the way so he can marry her. The second is a crewmate, Danglars, Monsieur Danglars. He's a crewmate of Edmond who hates him because he knows Edmond will demote or kick him off the ship or, fire him because he's deceitful and nobody likes him. He's actually kind of a despicable guy. And the third is a local of the other area, Caderousse, who's known the father and loaned Edmond some money, and he honestly just gets plastered drunk and just seems really, really offended that anyone's whose fortune is on the upswing despite him or anything like that, or independent of him. And so they send the letter off, and they send it off to Villefort, who gets this, and Edmond is arrested. And the prosecutor interrogates him and sees through the lies of the letter. And as Dantes can't read, he's hardly violent, and he's only fulfilling the dying wishes of his captain, which was, considered kind of a sacred duty, an honorable thing to do. However, the main problem here is that towards the end of their discussion, between the prosecutor and Dantes, is that the question is, who are you supposed to deliver this letter to? Because it does appear that the letter is from Bonapartists. It just seems that Edmond is not a part of the plot, and Edmond names the name, and the prosecutors, suddenly everything begins to change as far as his countenance, and then he goes, no, there's nothing, and he lets him go, and he goes back. But then the prosecutor arranges for Dantes to be arrested, because it turns out the letter who it was addressed to is the prosecutor's father, who indeed is a Bonapartist, which does bode ill for the prosecutor if it ever got out. So now he, of course, foresees that he is going to have to cover this up. And so he arranges for Edmond to be arrested and the letter destroyed, thus protecting his future. And the three men who wrote the letter are generally thrilled that their plot worked. The first man, Danglars, the crewmate rejoices because his career is secure, because Edmond was going to fire him for stealing. Ferdinand is delighted as Mercedes, who only had Edmond, now has no one, and now he can move in and, take over. And the third man, Caderousse, has very little recollection of everything because he was so drunk, But it succeeds, and Edmond is thrown in jail and disappears. And all of this is set up very well for the plot, because we're introduced to Edmond because we like him, because he's very competent and he's very honest and earnest. He wants to marry the woman he loves and continue to support his father and do right by his boss. The crew of the ship love him because he's a natural leader and does right by them because he helped get them back to safety. And for the audience, all of this goes to cause and generate us to like him. We also get to see what his future should have been, that he's poor. He's working himself up from nothing. He should have married Mercedes. He should have become captain, work up to eventually become captain, brought lots of food for his father so his father didn't have to starve for himself. And you can see this play out. After all, we have this trajectory where it's, this blue collar dream, if you will, to work your way up and set up a better life for your children and take care of your parents. But then everything changes by order of the prosecutor, Villefort. Edmond is taken on his wedding day and thrown into a dungeon off the a castle just off the coast, the Chateau d'If. Edmond is nearly driven suicidal by despair because he has no knowledge of what's going on. The prosecutor has assured him that nothing is the matter, that he's going to be released, that he's going to be let go, and he has no knowledge of the letter. He's like, nah, I'm not a Bonapartist. What more do you want to say? Like, I can't prove this. I'm not. He knows that there is a grave mistake has been made. He had a deal with the prosecutor, but now suddenly everything is going wrong. He's thrown in the deepest, darkest dungeon, and now he has no way out. He doesn't even know how long he's supposed to be in jail. All he knows is that, he had this deal, but everything, he was not going to say a word of who the letter was for. That was the agreement with the prosecutor, but now he's completely gone, And in his absence, as he's spending years and years in jail, his father eventually starves to death. The ship owner, Mr. Morel, who loved Dantes and tried to free him, but no prevail, he even has to be careful because he starts to become himself seen as a Bonapartist, trying to free this accused Bonapartist himself. But even after Napoleon Bonaparte takes power again and escapes Elba and takes power, he's defeated again, but nothing is able to change the fact that Edmond has been completely forgotten. Bureaucratic, mishaps or manipulations have kept him in jail. And so the prosecutor's career is safe. Ferdinand is safe to pursue his own ends. So is Danglars, and so is Caderousse. And so what we've done in this story is set up this whole aspect where we had this trajectory for how Edmond's life should have gone and what should have happened. But then we had this dramatic change because of this vicious betrayal, this framing by these other people who simply want to profit off of, an honest man's toil. And we like Edmond. As the audience, we really like Edmond. So this is horrific. We see this, vicious wrong happening. And so now we would love to see him get revenge. We would like something to happen to where he can right this ship, where he can get back at them. The only problem is now that Dantes is in prison. He's uneducated, he's poor, he has nothing. This is a problem. But the most important thing at this point in the story is that we are interested to see what happens next, because Dantes is a great character, so we're wanting to see what he's got up his sleeve, what will happen, what he's going to do. Edmond ends up spending 6 years in the darkness for the initial section of this. He's spending 6 years in the darkness of the Chateau d'If, and he starts losing his mind, And this is the tricky part to do as a writer, because what you need to be able to do is to have a section of writing or, of the story long enough that the audience is convinced that this is a long time, that it feels like a long time. You can't simply just go, and meanwhile, back at the ranch, 6 years later, a lot of time has passed. It doesn't feel like a lot of time has passed for the audience. You want the audience to understand, Edmond's hatred towards those or, whoever. At this point, he doesn't even know what's fully happened to him or who caused this. You want the audience to understand his suffering. And the most importantly, he has to suffer, because it's kind of like this, the deeper the suffering goes, the more is the thirst for revenge. The more we want to see, the justice be done. And so this is, you're digging this down to the suffering, and it has to feel real. It has to feel like he's been in prison for a long time. You can't just have the blank screen where it jumps forward, because it doesn't feel that wrong. But at the same point, it's tricky because you have to write about a man trapped in a tiny cell with no knowledge of the outside world, and where nothing really interesting can happen. And so you have to make it feel like it's a long time, but the plot really limits you on what you can write about. And all of this has to be done while making it interesting. And on the edge of, in Dantes for himself, while he's in the cell on the edge, getting pretty close to ending it all, he's just in this darkness. He hears someone making noise that sounds like digging, another prisoner. And he eventually comes to meet the elderly Abbe Faria, winds up in his cell, and this is where we get our second training, arc in the story. This is the training arc. This is something, akin to what we see overplayed in Dragon Ball Z, One Piece, Naruto, these different ones where it's like, I used to be a weakling, but I came back and now I'm strong. It's almost like it's so cheesy and overplayed. But what it gives us as a plot, what it gives us is a number of great things where we want to see this pay off. What a training arc does is a few things. There's story mechanics for the first part, and one is that you need to have a bully or some sort of antagonist wrong our main character. Check, we've got that. In order for this to make sense, the main character needs to have some sort of limitation. Knowledge, skill, power, they have to be weaker. And for the Count of Monte Cristo, Dantes is naive, he can't read, he's trusting, he's believing in the good nature of humanity. And of course, when it comes to the prosecutor, the royal prosecutor has a great deal of power over him. And the character needs to go through this training arc to the point where they no longer have this limitation. So when they meet the antagonist of the bully, they can get revenge. There's this explanation for why, hey, you were able to bully me and take advantage of me. Now I'm at the point where we can match each other. And there's this satisfying payoff that we're building towards. It feels earned, weak to strong. And we have a character, we have the audience have power, and it can enact vengeance. It's not that we were bullied and inherited millions of dollars. We were just given a handout that now we can enact revenge, and it's just cheap. It needs to feel earned. And so here back at the Chateau d'If, Edmond and the Abbe Faria spend 8 more years together, 8 years together. And Edmond learns languages, mathematics, astronomy, chemistry, medicine, culture, manners. He takes a poor sailor with no education, turns him into this cultured Renaissance man. And in the sale and ultimately what happens is the Abbé dies, but not before revealing the secret that he's been holding on to, the secret of a hidden treasure that he's been guarding all these years. And the Abbé dies, but Dantes manages, using the tunnel system they have, he's able to switch the bodies until, the guardsmen and the workers at the castle, they take the body of what they think is the body of the old man Faria, who's now died, and they take him and throw him in the sea, which is the graveyard for the Chateau d'If. Dantes swims and, meets some sailors, claims to have shipwrecked with his other men, and they take him on board, and he works with them for a while until he's able to finally visit the island of Monte Cristo and finds this treasure, as the Abbé described. He's now fabulously wealthy, and he hunts down Caderousse, one of the men who betrayed him, and under disguise, he learns of his own father's death by starvation and despair, despite the attempts of Mr. Morel. Mr. Morel, the ship owner who he previously worked for, had tried to save his father, but his father was driven to despair because he lost his son, and he's dead, he dies. And so then Dantes goes and then rescues Mr. Morel, the man who, he worked under. And this scene, it's so wonderful because you really get to understand how great of a person Mr. Morel is and how hard he tried to save Dantes' father and how much he grieved that he was unable to get Dantes out of prison. And Dantes shows up in disguise as, using the name Sinbad the sailor, and buys all of Mr. Morel's debts and stops him from shooting himself, ensures that his daughter can get married, and gives them a whole bunch of money, but this money he's given them is in the very same purse that Mr. Morel had given to Edmond's father, so, to try and keep him alive. And it's this beautiful gesture and this poetic scene that comes to fruition. So now the Morels are, have this mysterious benefactor who's completely saved them, and Edmond is able to turn and swear revenge on the three men most culpable for the death of his father, the loss of his love, and those 14 years of torture and darkness in the Chateau d'If. He's learned from Caderousse that Fernand, the man who was in love with Mercedes, has changed his name and become a count. He's very, heralded as a war hero. He's made himself very wealthy, and he's very well respected in society. And he has a successful career, and a young son at the prime of his youth. Danglars has become a baron and is enormously wealthy and continues to increase his fortune as a banker and speculator investor. And the prosecutor Villefort, and while his wealth is modest compared to others, his good name has only increased as a harsh but extremely fair advocate for the law, a model for justice itself. And now what we have is a story we've set up with Dantes with a near infinite fortune, the greatest education a man could have, and not a single will or wish in the world can hold him back. He sees himself as this dark avenger sent by God, a dead man whose body is still in the dark dungeons of the Chateau d'If, and after death, being so close to death, what is he to fear? What is stopping him? And this is the setup. I say setup, at this point, we're over a third of the story, and we're waiting to see what Dantes does next. He's had next to nothing but time, spent those especially in the first 6 years where it's just him alone in the darkness setting up this plan, and 14 years in total. And now he has the wealth of kings, an amazing setup as far as the story goes, and you want to continue reading. What's more, as his plan unfolds, you realize how meticulously detailed it is, and it makes sense. He's had all this time to think through it and plan it. And the other thing is he realizes this is the grandiose aspect of his whole scheme, is that a simple death is too good for these men. He is determined not only to kill them, to ruin them, but he wants to pull apart everything they value first. He wants to, Danglars is a banker. He wants to bankrupt him. He wants him to publicly ruin him down and make him as poor as the dirt before ending him. For the honorable Fernand, he's the count. He's this war hero. He wants to strip that away, take all of his crimes and throw it out there in front of the whole world. He wants to pull this down for Villefort, the prosecutor, who's this bastion of justice, the centerhead in Parisian life. He wants to throw that out to the winds and completely pull these men apart. And this is what, the training arc and this revenge arc do, is once you have this setup, it basically carries the whole story. There's another 600 pages that we're going to go through in this story just to see how his life is going to do it, how he's going to do it, how the Count is going to do this and destroy these men. And it's this amazing story to watch and play out. And it's just awesome. It's so much fun to watch because you have this feeling of confidence. There's this feeling of power because Dantes, he has all this wealth. He has all this ability. He's gone through the training arc. He's brilliant. And so now we get to see him have the upper hand and we get to see it play out. So let me know what you think down below. What you think about the book or the movie. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie. There's also an animated show. I think it's like Genkotsuo. I can't really know how to pronounce it, but artistically it's fantastic, but they deviate from the plot, which I still to this day do not understand. But let me know what you think. Yeah, what's your favorite part about the Count of Monte Cristo, and what do you guys like about it? So that's all I got. Let me know what y'all think. This is Fiction Applied. I'm Jeff Cassidy. Appreciate you watching. I'll see you in the next one.